Hello and welcome to another training session. Now today we're going to be playing with pivot tables. Now a lot of people ask me and they seem quite confused about pivot tables, and they've heard all these wonderful things about how useful they are, but they don't know how to do them. And I'll tell you now, the most difficult thing about pivot tables is actually understanding why they're called pivot tables. What they actually do is they summarize data. So logic would say that they should be called summary tables rather than pivot tables. However, later on I will show you why they're called pivot tables. But let's first have a look at what you need to start. So here in Excel, I've got a set of data. These are sales for a used car showroom. And there's a couple of things you need to look at, because if we want to summarize this data, first of all, it must be what we call a good set of data. So if I were to click somewhere inside my data and do Control A, the computer will select what it thinks is that range of data. Now you'll notice that it hasn't selected the bits at the top which are actually nothing to do with the data. It has selected the header row, and it's selected all the way down to the bottom, and it hasn't selected anything that's not data. So this is really a good set of data. It's not perfect, but it's good. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just to look at the data yourself and understand what we call the granularity of the data. Now the granularity, if you imagine a gravel beach compared to a sandy beach, the smallest thing you can pick up on a sandy beach is a grain of sand. The smallest thing you pick up on a gravel beach is a pebble. So the granularity is different. So in this instance, my months, so my units of time, the smallest granularity is individual months. So the smallest I can analyze these by is month by month. I can't analyze these sales by day of the week because I don't have that level of granularity or that level of detail. So ideally what you want in your data is the smallest granularity that's available. So ideally for each of these sales, they actually happened on a particular day at a particular time, and ideally that's the level of detail that I would want in my data. Now in my summary, I can then choose to summarize by month, by quarter, by day of the week, by time of day, but I can't do that if I don't have the granularity in my data to start with. Okay, the second thing to look at is that we have things within our data that we can group by. Now what I mean by that is we have multiples of the same thing in one of the columns. So for example, still sticking with the month, I could group by January. So I could select all the ones that are January and see a total of the sales for January. I could also group by Toyota because I have more than one instance of Toyota in my make column. I couldn't group by the sale number because these are all unique values. They're already unique values, so if I tried to group by each of these values, I would end up with the same list I've got here. In other words, it wouldn't summarize the data at all. And the same goes for price. It's actually quite unlikely that I would have two of these where they're the same price. Possible, but unlikely. And so it wouldn't really make sense to group by price. Now here where we have customer age, you might say again that's something we wouldn't group by, but these are not customer ages, these are customer age bands or categories, and yes, these are repeated. So I have 26 to 35, 26 to 35, 26 to 35. So I could group by all of that particular age group band of customer. So where I have more than one thing in a column and I could group by it, that becomes a field that I might want to summarize by. Where I have only unique values, I don't want to summarize by that column. Okay, so let's have a look at one more thing we should do before we start a pivot table. So this is actually quite important, and it's a step that a lot of people forget. And what it is turning the data into a table before we then look at it as a pivot table. So the reason we turn it into a table, and I just did Control T there, is once I've turned it into a table, I can give it a name. So these are my sales, and if I now refer to this table it's referred to by its name. If I don't do that, the computer will hard code in that range of data, which is basically going down to row 104, and that will be my range of data. If I then add new rows, they will not be included in my pivot table. I need to redefine the range if I want them included, and that becomes a pain, and it's also something that people can forget. So get in the habit of always starting from a table, and then to insert a pivot table, all we do is we come up and we say summarize with pivot table. Now I'm going to use the defaults here, so I'm going to have my range. Because I was in the table, it's picked up my table sales rather than hard coding in an actual cell range. And I'm going to put this on a new worksheet. I'm not going to add it to the data model, but I am going to have it on a new worksheet just to give me some extra space to see what's going on. So I click OK. Now over here is my pivot table, which has nothing in it at the moment. So it puts this icon there so that I can see where my pivot table would go. I have something to click on. Now over here I have a list of fields. Now all of these fields are actually all of the different headings from my table, or the top row from my data range, wherever I chose. Now if I wanted to see a unique list of salespeople, what I can do is I can come over here to my salespeople and simply check that box there. What the machine has done is it's automatically put it into the rows, and there is a list of unique salespeople. So I've got 3 different salespeople. If I want to remove that, I can either uncheck it, or my preferred way of doing it is simply to click and drag it off to the left, so it's no longer in one of these fields. Now the other way of putting the field in is to click and drag where you want it to go. Now this does give you a bit more control, because it means that you can either put it into the rows or you can put it into the columns. Now this is why it's called a pivot table. Back in my data, my salespeople are listed vertically. I can pivot this 90 degrees and list them horizontally. Now you might say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, let's have a look at if I wanted to analyze or summarize by 2 different columns. I might want to have one of them vertically and one of them horizontally. Now at the moment that's still not much use, because I'm not seeing any numbers in the main body of my pivot table. This is called the value area. Now if I take the price, for example, and drag that into my values area, this is now summarizing Belinda's sales of BMWs. So that cell there is Belinda BMW. This cell here is Belinda, all of her sales. And down here there is BMW, all BMW sales. So this is the beauty of a pivot table. Quick and easy summaries. If I were to look at the data here, that would take me a long time to actually work out. It takes a few seconds and I have a summary there in a pivot table. Now I can very easily sort this data, so I right click and say sort, and this is now sorting by make, best selling to worst selling. I could have done that individually within any of these columns as well, to sort by that salesperson's best selling make and model, and you'll see that in fact Joe was much better at selling VWs than he was at BMWs. It just so happened that Fred's BMW sales so outweighed the others that it's pushed the grand total for BMW higher than all the others. Okay, well let's simplify this a little. Let's take the salesperson out, so we're just looking at the individual makes of car. Now this is telling me the total sum of how much they sold for, but what about if I wanted to see how many sales were made? Well, dragging price down into the values, because price is a numeric field, it defaults to the sum of price. Now I could drag this down there again, and I end up with the sum of price twice. What I could then do is right click on the field and say summarize by count instead of price. This will show you how many individual sales were made rather than the sum of the amount of those sales. However, there's another way of doing this. If I drag a numeric field into values, it gives me the sum of that field. If I drag a text field down into the values, it will automatically do a count of them. Now, you might say, well, surely count of salesperson is not what I'm looking to do. But actually, if every one of these sales has been attributed to a salesperson, it would in fact give me the sum of sales because every single one of these were filled in. If I had a field that were blank, then I wouldn't want to choose that column. I might want to choose a different column. Yeah? So a column that will always have something in it might be my sale ID number, but bear in mind this is at the moment a numeric field, and therefore it will default to giving me the sum of these numbers rather than a count of these numbers. Now, as I said, it's very easy to fix that. All you do is you right click on the field and you then come down to summarize values by and change it to sum instead of count. Now in this case that would not give me a decent answer because I've dragged the text down in there, so I can't sum text. Okay, now the other thing we can look at here is the formatting. So the formatting we've got at the moment, we want these to be in money. Now normally with formatting I'd go up to here and I'd choose something like a currency, and you'll notice that when I do that it only formats the cell that I've got selected. Now a way of thinking about this is that my pivot table is not a part of the table of my sheet. It is something that's on top of my sheet. Now if I'm seeing through that to the cell underneath, I'm seeing the formatting fed through from the cell underneath. But if I were to change this, and if I'd formatted just a few cells, and I were to change it and have more makes of car, perhaps some of the other cells that I'd formatted, let's imagine I'd only formatted that range, perhaps some extra cells might not already be formatted. So when I added in extra makes, I'd end up with some unformatted cells. So there's a better way of doing this. What we don't do is format the cells. What we want to do is format the number in this field. So we don't format cells, we use the number format to format the number in this field. And this will format every single instance of that number within the field. So I'm going to say currency, I'll put no decimal places and click OK, and this is formatted the whole lot in one hit. If I add in extra makes, they will also be formatted, because in fact it is the whole of this field here that has been formatted. Okay, the other thing that we can do within a pivot table is we can put on something called a slicer. Now this is one of the most amazing features, and it's effectively just a filter, but it's a very easy filter to see and to be able to use. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to my pivot table analyze ribbon, and I'm going to insert a slicer. Now again, I get all of my fields, the same fields as I had over here, and I can choose which one I want to use as a slicer. Now I could use one, or I could use more than one. So I'm going to check both of those and click OK. I now have both of these slicers here, and I can rearrange these, resize them, and I can also, within my slicer menu, I can change the number of columns that I have for each of these slicers. And with my slicers, I generally like to put them towards the top of my pivot table, and I might want to make a little bit of extra space between my pivot table and the top so that I can put the slicers above it. Now this is something that I prefer to do. It's not something you have to do. The reason I like to do it is if I use a slicer and it were to hide that chunk of my pivot table because of the fields I'd chosen in my slicer, perhaps my slicer would also be hidden if it was within that range of fields. So I don't put them alongside my pivot table, I put them above or below. Generally I put them above. Now the way the slicer works is if I click, it will filter this pivot table by just the field that I had selected. So I've now got this selected just for January. I now have it selected for just Belinda in January. This is fantastic. If I want to clear the slicer, I click on the clear filter button and I end up with all my data again. Okay. One other thing that we probably want to do is we probably want to see this not as just a table, but as something called a pivot chart. So again, I can go to my pivot table and I simply say pivot chart. I'm just going to choose a default chart there and click OK. And now because I had two separate fields here, I had my first value field was the sum of price. Now my smallest number there were 34,500, and then I had a count of salesperson. My biggest number there was 20. So 20 related to the 34,500 really is nothing. So actually this type of chart is not what I want. So I'm going to go into my pivot chart tables and I'm now going to change my chart type, and I'm going to change it to be a combo chart, and I'm going to put my salesperson on the secondary axis. Now what this lets me see is how many sales were made compared to how much they were sold for. Now these count of salesperson, I don't like the way they look because that's not actually the count of salesperson, it's actually a count of sales. So I can edit this, and this is now telling me the count of sales or the sum of price, and these are all by make. Okay, so I'll just pop my chart over there, resize it, and my slicers will work on the chart just the same as they do with everything else. And straight away we're seeing some clear insights, and we're seeing that Fred is very good at selling BMWs and he sells them for quite a lot of money, but he's not very successful at selling other brands of car. Belinda is fairly good across the board, whereas Joe is good at these first three and then fairly good across the board, but not particularly good at BMWs, unlike the other two who are both very successful at BMWs. Now what we can't do is draw conclusions from that data. We can't draw the conclusion and say that actually Joe is rubbish at selling BMWs. That's not what the data is telling us. What the data is telling us is that he's made fewer sales. It might be that he doesn't work on BMWs. He doesn't actually go forward and sell the BMWs because, well, guess what? Fred is a BMW rep. That's why Fred has so much more success at selling BMWs than other brands, is because that's the one he tends to represent, because that's who employs him. Joe doesn't sell very many BMWs because he's on the same shift as Fred. The reason Belinda sells more BMWs is because she's never on the same shift as Fred. So there might be lots of underlying reasons why the data is telling us certain things, and what we shouldn't do is draw conclusions. However, pivot tables are fantastic. They're really, really useful, and I strongly advise anybody to definitely get used to playing with pivot tables. Now, let's just have a look at this. I'm going to modify it slightly because I sometimes get asked, why would I put something in the columns and why would I put something in the rows? Well, just take a look at this and see how it looks. And now I'm going to switch them round and see how that looks. Now the way I had it initially, it fitted nicely and cleanly on my screen, and I would say that this way doesn't fit so well on the screen. Now why is that, you might say? Well, my simple logic is if I have a lot of things, they don't tend to suit so well going horizontally. So if I have a lot of things, a lot of different groups, I will tend to put them vertically and have the fewer number of groups going horizontally. So I would put my makes in the rows and my salespeople in the columns, and to me that's a much more pleasing layout. The other thing that I would tend to do is, if I had units of time, like for example here we have month, I would put them horizontally. So I will put them in the columns because I want to show my periods of time going across from left to right rather than down from top to bottom. So I still have my many things down in the rows, but this time I have my few things, which are my periods of time going across. Now clearly if you had 52 weeks of the year, that would be many things going across, but I would still put them in the columns because that's how I prefer to see time going left to right. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about today on pivot tables and pivot charts. I hope you've enjoyed playing around with pivot tables. Do have some fun, just play, experiment, do what you like with them. Couple of key rules: remember, turn your data into a table before you start. That makes it dynamic. If you add data to the table, it's then automatically included in the pivot table, and all you have to do is hit refresh to get it up on the screen. If you like this video, if you found it useful, click on the links down below. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and thank you for listening.